provisions are untested. They were not subject of any hearings of our committee. They were added at the last minute before the markup, and they change what I think is the bedrock National Environmental Policy Act. They set arbitrary deadlines, rush decisions, lead to delays later and mistakes in litigation. And haste makes waste, both for taxpayer dollars and for natural resources. The administration doesn't want these changes. Yesterday, the chairwoman heeded our call and changed the bill. The provisions will now sunset in 10 years, and I believe, Madam Chair, this is a step in the right direction. But make no mistake, these provisions are still a very risky move. And if this gets worse, these provisions could risk a presidential veto. So, Madam Chair, I know that you've committed to me that we could have a hearing on the provisions that are in the law, the MAP 21 provisions, that EPA, all the I'd ask for 30 seconds.
30 seconds more.
Okay.
Yeah,
without objection.
Madam Chair, that you've committed that the relevant federal resource agencies on MAP 21, which has similar provisions here, they're in the law. The resource agencies can come before our committee. We can have questioning. You'll be there. We can have the CEQ or whoever be a part of that. And I very much appreciate you working with me on this. Because you're working with me on this, I'm not going to move forward. I'm not going to offer the amendment at this time.
President,
Senator from California.
I ask unanimous consent that I have a minute and a half.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. I want to thank my colleague for withdrawing, for not offering his amendment. And he and I see this very, very differently. But first, I want to say that I have committed to a hearing. I told my colleague he can get as much time as he wants, but I have to correct the record. And if I could have some order.
Will come to order.
My colleague said that this project delivery reform was a last-minute addition. Project delivery reform was in the bill as it was voted out of committee without a dissenting vote. Let me reiterate. This is not a last-minute issue. Project delivery reform was in the bill when it got voted out, and here's why. Two reasons. One is projects are being delayed. Environmental projects, flood control projects, they're being delayed. And some delay is necessary when there's new information, and they could still have a delay. But what we do in this bill, and it has been changed for the better, I think my colleague's right on that, is we sunset the provision in 10 years. If I could have order.
Senate will come to order.
Just like I gave you order, too. Thanks. So here's the deal. We sunset these provisions in 10 years, number one. Number two, for the first time in history, the resource agencies that my friend cares so much about and I care so much about, Fish and Wildlife, EPA, all the rest, will be in the room with the Corps setting the deadlines. So it's very important that we get our job done, and bureaucratic agencies have to get the work done. And I think this reform is one we'll be proud of. I look forward to those hearings. I want to thank my colleague, and we will get on with this and make sure this reform works the way we anticipate it will. I thank you. I thank my colleague. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate, equally divided, prior to a vote in relation to Amendment 909 offered by the Senator from North Dakota, Mr. Hoeven.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
I understand my amendment is already pending, so I would just point out that I have a modification at the desk. This is a very simple amendment. It simply provides that the Corps of Engineers cannot charge a state or a tribe or municipality.
I could say the Senate is not in order. I believe this is our last amendment. And this is an important amendment to my friend. It's hugely important to many states. And it would be nice if we could just give him the courtesy.
Senate will be in order.
I'd like to thank my colleague from California, and like to thank both Senator Boxer and Senator Vitter for their work on this amendment. I appreciate it very much. It's a very simple amendment. It says the Corps of Engineers cannot charge a state for water, cannot charge fees for water when it violates the state's water rights. It affects municipalities and tribes as well. We have made sure that it does not score under the CBO rules. We have strong bipartisan support, Senator Thune, Senator Heidkamp, Senator Baucus, Senator Johnson. And this does not affect the master manual on the Missouri River or any of the authorized uses. I want to emphasize that. Again, a very simple amendment. It ensures that states' rights are properly protected, and I encourage a yes vote. Thank you.
Without objection, the amendment has been modified.
Madam President, if I could be heard on this.
Senator from California.
I am supporting this amendment. I think it is very important to the states affected, and there are several states. The fact is we don't want to see the Corps start a water war, and the chair has discussed this with me, and I'm very grateful to her and to Senator Hoeven for really explaining this. The tribes are involved in this. We don't want to see them get in trouble with this. And I think the Corps has to respect the fact that there are these water rights in place. So I will be supporting this amendment.
Who yields time in opposition? The senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, if I could just ask unanimous consent for 10 seconds.
Without objection.
I also strongly support this amendment. I think it's a very reasonable, common-sense amendment.
If there's no further debate.
For voice vote.
Questions on the amendment as modified? All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment as modified is agreed to.
Thank you, Madam President. And I'd again like to thank both of the managers of this bill. Thank you.
Under the previous order, the cloture motion is withdrawn, and the clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Counter number 44 as 601, a bill to provide for the conservation and development of water and related resources and so forth and for other purposes.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, if I could be
Can we have order?
If I could be heard for just less than a minute. I want to thank every single senator here. We have literally worked, I think, with every one of you on this bill. Senator Vitter and I, we have our differences in a number of areas, but when it comes to the infrastructure of our country, we work very well together, as I did with Senator Inhofe. The committee voted this bill out unanimously, and I can say we made it better on this floor. We added amendments that you came to us with that made this a better bill. And I also want to note that our staffs are unbelievable. And I'm not going to name names now, but I will put them in the record. My chief of staff and her team, Senator Vitter's chief and his team, work seamlessly together in the most wonderful cooperative fashion. And I want everyone to know this bill is about 500,000 jobs, thousands of businesses, critical flood control, environmental restoration projects, harbor maintenance, inland waterways, and we've adopted dozens and dozens of amendments. We're very excited about this vote. We hope you'll all vote aye. It would be really a wonderful signal. And then to the House, that they would get on with this as well. Thank you very much. I would yield to my friend.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I join in all of the comments of the distinguished chairman of the committee, and I strongly support this bill as well. It's a jobs bill. It's a water, maritime infrastructure bill that's good for the economy, and it does that in a way that doesn't increase the deficit a penny, that contains no earmarks, that institutes important reforms to deauthorize projects that are not moving forward so that it should even be authorization net neutral, provides reforms in terms of the Corps of Engineers which are needed. So this is a very strong bipartisan bill, and I hope it's also some little suggestion of how we can move forward in this body, work in a bipartisan way, and have real debate and amendments and votes on the floor. I think that's another whole aspect of this experience that has been very, very positive. I urge a yes vote.
The question now occurs on S-601 as amended. The clerk will call the roll.
Yeas and ayes.
Yeas and Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Tavenner. Mr. Menendez. Ms. Baldwin. Rankin. Bitter. Blumenthal. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich.
I know. Aye. Vote yes. Brown yes.
Ms. McCray. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Ms. Cox. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Thank you.
It eventually wins its way down.
Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Sir. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coburn.
Did you get Sheila? I don't know if he was looking at me. I had a telephone in my ear. I can't imagine he was voting.
Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cowan. Thank you. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
No. I'm not taking. I'm just trying to sit here.
Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Catskill. Yeah.
Maybe they were all convinced by Donald.
Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reid of Rhode Island, Mr. Reid of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Crapo, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Franken, Graham, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Kirk, Klobuchar, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murphy, Nelson, Portman, Pryor, Reid of Rhode Island, Roberts, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Burr, Coburn, Cornyn, Cruz, Flake, Heller, Johnson of Wisconsin, Leahy, McCain, Paul, Rubio, and Scott. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Reid. Mr. Reid of Nevada. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski? Aye. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Hoeven? Mr. Hoeven? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Cowan? Mr. Cowan? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? No. Mr. Corker? Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye.
there any senator in the chamber wishing to vote?
He did.
Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their votes? If not, the yeas are 83, the nays are 14, and the bill as amended is passed.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I now ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to pre-morning business until 2 p.m. today. Senators be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent that 2 p.m. the Senate proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 40 and 92. At the time until 4:30 be equally divided in the usual form. Senator Bach is in control of the time from 4:15 to 4:30. Upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate proceed to vote with no intervening action or debate on the nominations order listed, with 2 minutes for debate between the votes, and that the second vote be 10 minutes in length. The motion be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, and no further motions being ordered to the nominations. Any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record. That the President be immediately notified of sense action, and the Senate resume legislative session. I yield to my friend from Oregon.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from Oregon.
I appreciate Leader Reid yielding me this time and Senator McConnell being on the floor for this, and I'll be brief. As I discussed earlier this morning, yesterday's new report from the Congressional Budget Office highlights why it would be so important to have a conference committee between the House and the Senate go to work on the budget. What the Congressional Budget Office reported yesterday was a 24% reduction in the budget deficit. Really quite a remarkable projection, and coupled with the improving jobs and housing numbers, you now have, Madam President, economic experts across the political spectrum. For example, people like Glenn Hubbard, a leading Republican economist, saying it's important for the Congress to look at these long-term economic challenges. In fact, you have economic experts of both political parties saying Washington ought to be doing more about the long-term economic challenges and not just have the day-to-day kind of battling. Going to a budget conference will give us that opportunity. It will give us the opportunity to look at the 10-year budget window, and particularly issues like health care and taxes. So in the name of dealing with those long-term economic challenges that I think is highlighted by yesterday's projections, I would ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of Calendar 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 is amended, be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table. The Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate, all with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. I would ask
the Republican leader.
I would ask consent that the Senator modify his request so it not be in order for the Senate to consider a conference report that includes tax increases or reconciliation instructions to increase taxes or raise the debt limit.
Does the Senator so modify his request?
I do not, Madam President. The point that I have tried to make is that the Congressional Budget Office didn't talk about the Senate relitigating the past discussion.
Parliamentary inquiry, is that an objection?
Does the Senator object to the modification?
I do.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the Senator from Oregon's original request?
Object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
If I could just be recognized for another brief moment. This highlights how unfortunate it is that we don't look to the future as the Congressional Budget Office projections really laid out for us yesterday. The Congressional Budget Office didn't talk about relitigating the past votes here in the United States Senate. They said specifically the deficit was significantly lower than earlier projected, which, on the basis of what I've just cited, economic experts of both political parties saying it's time to look to the long-term challenges, particularly Medicare and taxes, I came today to say that a budget conference would provide that kind of window, an opportunity to look particularly at long-term health care challenges like chronic care in Medicare. I see my colleague from the Senate Finance Committee. He knows we've been talking about tax reform, Democrats and Republicans. Again, a bipartisan opportunity that we could achieve through a conference. I proposed that today based on that new evidence yesterday, and regrettably, we can't go to conference because it seems that the leader on the other side will only go to conference if we can relitigate the stuff that happened in the United States Senate, which he lost on. So I hope that colleagues will look at that new Congressional Budget Office report. They'll look at the jobs picture, the housing starts, all of which seems to be improving in the short term, and will pay more attention to what economic experts of both political parties are saying. Is we ought to be looking to our long-term challenges, particularly in health care and taxes. With the Senate budget conference between the House and the Senate providing an opportunity to look at that 10-year window, we could do exactly what economic experts of both political parties are talking about. I think it's unfortunate we have not been given that opportunity today, and I hope we'll be given it in the days ahead. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from New York.
Well, thank you, Madam President. First, I thank my colleague from Oregon for offering his proposal, and sorry it was rejected. We should be going to conference on the budget. There is no question about it. It's hard for us to understand how on the other side people have been railing for 4 years. You didn't have a budget. Now we have a budget, and they don't want to move forward with it. But that's not what I rose to speak about today. I rise to express my First, I also want to say to the Senator from California and the Senator from Louisiana, job well done. The WRDA bill was a very good bill, and it will help both the Port of New York City, one of the great ports of the world, as well as our Great Lake ports, which are having their own troubles in terms of dredging. But there was an extreme disappointment in the bill, no fault of my colleague from California. I'm extremely disappointed at the objection some of my colleagues raised to even allowing a vote on the Landrieu amendment to the WRDA bill. And I, along with Senator Landrieu and others, will keep fighting until this common sense amendment passes. I'm speaking of amendment number 888. I was proud to co-sponsor it. Very simply, it would delay for 5 years any premium increases resulting from revised flood maps. The purpose of the amendment was to provide FEMA enough time to complete the study they were required to complete over a month ago on affordability of increased premiums. Senator Toomey is right. We just passed a flood insurance reauthorization 10 months ago, but it was always the intent, and many of us worked hard on that, under bigger waters, that FEMA would conduct an affordability study before higher premiums would go into effect. That way, Congress could review the findings and recommendations and address important issues related to affordability and neighborhood sustainability. Senator Landrieu's amendment was carefully crafted to give FEMA time to complete its study, then allow Congress 6 months to respond. For technical reasons, she amended it to a straight 5-year delay. I thought that was better. But the purpose was the same. The logic is irrefutable. Why bother to do a study at all if we're going to just allow FEMA to charge ahead and start raising premiums all over the country? And I say this to my colleagues. The senator from Louisiana knows it well. We know it well in New York. But you're going to be finding out across the country that flood insurance premiums are going to rise so high that they're unaffordable to average middle-class people. What do you say to the homeowner who's forced into the choice of either paying crushing flood premiums or leaving their home in their neighborhood? Do we say to them, sorry, we just couldn't get around to thinking about difficult cases like yours just yet? That's not going to stand. That's not fair. It's not acceptable. I note for my colleagues who might think this is just a Hurricane Sandy-related issue, it's not. New Yorkers are facing this situation because our flood maps are being revised, a process that was well underway before Sandy. So the increased premiums many New Yorkers could well face will face all of your constituents. As FEMA starts revising flood maps, and they're increasing the number of homes included and increasing the level at which homeowners have to pay, every one of you is going to be facing the same problem we're facing in New York. $9,500 for flood insurance for someone who makes $40,000 or $50,000 and lives in a modest home? Forget it. We can't have that, and I will tell FEMA right now, that will not stand. Something will give, because the situation is untenable. The original bill provided for a study, and then Congress could act on that study and modify the bill. But now we're moving forward without even the study being done. In fact, people in some states are already seeing their premiums rise up to 25% a year, and many more states will be covered over the next 2 years. If you think it's just coastal states, like my state of New York and the state of Louisiana, it is not. In fact, according to FEMA, my friend Senator Toomey's home state is one of the states that relies most heavily on flood insurance. Pennsylvania ranks 7th in the total amount of NFIP payouts, 7th in the number of claims filed since the program began. So we all have an interest to get this right, that we proceed with eyes wide open in attempts to bring the flood insurance onto sounder financial footing, that we have the benefit of all the data and analysis we need. My prediction, if we don't change this, there will be no flood insurance. Or at the very minimum, we will let it be optional for everybody. Let people decide. Because to force people between paying an amount they can't afford and forcing people to leave their homes is a choice this Congress will ultimately not abide for. It's important to remember, if people can't afford flood insurance, they're going to drop out of the program. Their communities might not adopt new flood maps when proposed because they know the cost is prohibitive. When future disasters hit, these families and communities will be entirely dependent on federal aid to help them rebuild. And that will cost the taxpayers even more. So it's important we ensure that the program is both financially sound and accessible to ordinary middle-class families. Something is very wrong with a program that requires middle-class families to pay over $10,000 a year for a policy with coverage that's capped at $250,000. Now, you may ask, why am I so passionate about this issue? Because I visited too many families, too many communities in New York City and in upstate New York, where the prospects of higher premiums are causing residents to rethink whether they can even afford to remain in the homes in which they've lived, many of them for their whole lives. Afford to live in the neighborhoods they grew up in, where their families and friends live, where their children go to school. Families are being forced to make this choice in neighborhoods from Staten Island to the Rockaways to Massapequa and east, and upstate in places like Schoharie County and the southern tier counties like Broome, Tioga, North Country counties like Essex. It would be a shame if we were allowed this to happen, all because FEMA didn't get around to studying the impact of higher flood rates and Congress didn't have a chance to respond. So I hope, Madam President, that by the time New York's maps are completed and New Yorkers have completed the process of rebuilding in the wake of Sandy, fears of $10,000 flood insurance premiums for middle-class homes will prove to have been incorrect. But right now, those fears are very real, and they're putting the future of some of New York's most tightly knit middle-class neighborhoods at risk. As I noted previously, New York's flood maps were in the process of being revised before Sandy hit, but in the wake of Sandy, it adds insult to injury when families who are spending their entire savings to repair their home are told that in a year or two they may not be able to afford living there. In conclusion, Madam President, I'm disappointed we didn't get a vote on this bill, but I will keep pushing and pushing and pushing until this awful situation is rectified. I know Senator Landrieu will. I know Senator Vitter will. The issue is too important to too many New Yorkers and too many Americans, and I will not stop until we get a vote and until we ultimately succeed. I am confident many more of my colleagues will begin to hear from their constituents about the challenges they're facing as flood premiums are increased, and they will see the wisdom of Senator Landrieu's amendment, and Congress will ultimately act to fix this problem once and for all. With that, I appreciate my colleagues giving me the time and yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from California.
Madam President, I think the senator from New York is pointing out an issue that Senator Vitter and I agree with, which is that we should have had a vote on the Landrieu-Vitter amendment, which would have definitely moved in the direction of ensuring that people's insurance rates for flood protection don't go through the roof. It was very disappointing that the senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Toomey, opposed having even a vote on this. But you know what? We'll have other days in the sun, I say to my friend, where we will deal with this issue because it's just too important to too many people across the nation. But I don't want that to dim what just happened here in the United States, and I don't want the fact that there was one disappointment to take away from what just happened in the Senate. And what just happened in the Senate is that 83 colleagues, 83 strong, voted for the Water Resources Development Act that came out of the Environment and Public Works Committee with a very strong, unanimous vote, and that Senator Vitter and I, working together for the first time on a big bill like this, were able to put aside other differences and come together in an area where we both agree. And that is that it is essential to have a strong infrastructure in the greatest nation in the world and in our states. It is essential that people not be worried that bridges will fall, that they won't have good roads, that they won't have their ports deepened so that they can accept these big ships that go in and out, that they will be vulnerable to flooding, and that they will not be able to restore wetlands, which are so critical to preventing floods. This bill is so critical to the infrastructure and to the environment. Anyone who's been to the Everglades knows how critical it is to make sure the Everglades remain. It's a gift from God, and we have the responsibility. Anyone who knows the Chesapeake Bay knows how important it is to ensure that it's healthy, and we do that in this bill. And we do our best to ensure that the types of flooding that we saw in Katrina will be minimized. We made many, many reforms, and I feel good about them. Now, I really have to say, without the staff, none of this would be possible. I am so blessed, and so is Senator Vitter, to have the kinds of staff that we have. They are dedicated. The hours that they work have no bounds. The other night, we were talking at 11 o'clock. My staff was there. This type of a bill is not easy to get through because every state has its own needs. Every state has its own challenges. Every state has its own problems. And we were able, because of our staffs working endlessly, to meet the needs, I believe, of the whole country. And that's why we have votes from the entire country. We have votes from so many states because this bill is truly reflective of the needs of our communities. So I want to say to Bettina Poirier, my Chief of Staff and Chief Counsel, you certainly know how to get a bill through. You certainly know how to manage a staff. And you certainly have made wise decisions in terms of your staff. We have Jason Albritton and Ted Ilston and Tyler Rushforth and David Napoliello and Andrew Dorman. There's only 6 names that I mentioned, and they handled this bill from essentially 100 different senators pounding on your door, including this senator, saying what and why and how, and you answered it. I also want to close by thanking some other wonderful staffers of Senator Reed's, Gary Myrick, Tim Mitchell, Bill Douster, Alex McDonough, and I have to say Tyler Cusick, of the Budget Committee who helped us, and Rima Doden, who came in and really helped us make sure we had the votes when we needed the votes. And I'm going to make one thank you. I know Senator Vitter is going to name his staff, and I'm not going to mention one of their names, but he speaks for me when he thanks them. But there's one person, and that's Neil Chatterjee, and I hope I don't ruin his career by thanking him. He works for Senator McConnell. He helped us greatly. Just know the lay of the land. He said, this is where we have problems. This is where we can come together. And I'll tell you something, Madam President, managing these bills, you just need to know where you stand. And you need to know where you are. So having the support of both Senator Reid and Senator McConnell and their staffs has just made our world a lot easier. So we say to the House, this is your chance, step up to the plate. I know that Congressman Schuster, Chairman Schuster over there really wants a bill. We stand ready to work with him. I think our bill provides a roadmap. And with that, I want to again say to Senator Vitter, it has been just terrific to work with you on this, and I look forward to continuing our collaboration anytime and any place that we can come together. And with that, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I stand to echo all of those thoughts. And let me also start with a lot of overdue thanks. First of all, let me thank a great partner in Chairman Boxer. As she said many times, we don't agree about a lot of things, including important things within the jurisdiction of our committee. But we can come together constructively, really productively on the infrastructure side of our committee, both highway infrastructure and water infrastructure, and that's what we wanted to do from the very beginning on this bill. And the crucial element to any success like this is the will and the determination to do it. We both had that, but I really thank her for her leadership in that regard and being a great partner in that regard. And I certainly echo all of her thoughts about the staff work, and I'm deeply, deeply indebted to all of the staff work, particularly on my side, that went into this bill. The Chair and I personally dealt with probably a couple of dozen issues and semi-crises that would crop up over time. But if we did that with a couple of dozen, our staffs did that with hundreds and solved those problems to the satisfaction of a huge number of members, and that was reflected in the vote. So I really thank my staff and both staffs, but I'm particularly indebted to my staff for all of that hard work, particularly Zach Begg, Charles Brittingham, Chris Tomasi, Sarah Veach, Rebecca Louvier, Jill Landry, Luke Bowler, and Cheyenne Steele. They all put in enormous hours. Of course, Charles, much more than anyone else, but they all put in enormous hours, and I really thank them for excellent work. I also want to emphasize what a positive bill this is, Madam President. I talked a few minutes ago, right before the vote, about the strengths of the bill from a national point of view: jobs, waterborne commerce, reform of the Corps of Engineers. This bill is also really important for my home state of Louisiana, and I just want to underscore that in closing. Three areas it's particularly important. First of all, we have a lot of important flood control, hurricane protection projects, and this bill moves a number of those projects forward in a crucial way. Projects like the Louisiana Coastal Area Ecosystem Projects, Morganza to the Gulf, which is vitally important for protection of Lafourche and Terrebonne parishes and surrounding areas. Also, the West Shore Hurricane Protection Project. That's right in the middle of where Hurricane Isaac hit. We need to get that done, and it's now moving forward. And the Southwest Louisiana Coastal Hurricane Protection Study. Finally, although it's not as far along, there's really important work with regard to St. Tammany and other coastal parishes, achieving flood protection in those areas, including a barrier at the lake or near the lake, Lake Pontchartrain for St. Tammany. And that concept will move forward because of this bill. Second big category in the bill is Corps of Engineers reform and accountability. Those of us who lived through Hurricane Katrina saw some of the best and unfortunately some of the worst of what the federal government has to offer. And on the side that needs improvement is improvement. We need streamlining and reform at certain agencies, including the Corps of Engineers. This bill brings that reform to the Corps of Engineers in a number of important areas, like the proposal Senator Nelson of Florida and I have. It also streamlines and expedites the process, particularly with regard to environmental review, and that's very important. And third and finally, Madam President, this bill advances waterborne commerce by dredging our harbors and ports and rivers and getting that work done, which is vital, which is necessary if maritime commerce is going to move forward and help drive the engine of our economy. We have major reforms in this bill with regard to the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, major reforms in the bill with regard to the Inland Waterway Trust Fund, dredging what we need to dredge, moving forward on key harbors and ports and waterways. And that's important for our Louisiana maritime sector, which is a big part of the national economy. So there are a lot of positives to this bill, Madam President. That's why I was proud to help develop it and support it, and that's why I'm very, very pleased today that it got overwhelming bipartisan support. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, yesterday the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, estimated that this year's budget deficit will be 24% lower than it projected just a few months ago. And that is very, very good news for our country. Let's not forget that just 5 or so years ago, when President Obama came into office in January of 2009, he inherited a $1.4 trillion deficit, $1.4 trillion, as a result of 2 unpaid-for wars, huge tax breaks for the wealthy and large corporations, an unfunded Medicare Part D prescription drug program written by the drug and insurance companies, and, of course, the terrible recession, which resulted in less revenue coming into the federal government. We experienced 4 straight years of deficits above $1 trillion. This year, the CBO projects that the deficit will just be $642 billion. $642 billion is a lot of money. It is a large deficit. We've got to continue working on that issue. But clearly, for a variety of reasons, we have made substantial progress, and we should be proud of that. By 2015, the CBO is projecting that the federal deficit will total just 2.1% of GDP, exactly what those folks who were involved with Simpson and Bowles told us we needed to achieve in order to be fiscally sustainable over the long term. So, Madam President, the good news is that we have made significant progress on deficit reduction. We should be proud of that. However, we must be cognizant that we do not place ourselves in a situation in which the operation was a success, but the patient died. And the patient that I am talking about, of course, is the disappearing middle class, the backbone of this great country. So, in other words, while a lot of attention has been focused on deficit reduction, which is important, it is high time we started focusing on what is happening to tens of millions of working families, people who are unemployed, people who are working at very low-wage jobs, elderly people who can't afford their prescription drugs, families that can't afford to send their kids to college or provide child care for their young ones. So my main point today is let us start focusing on the issue of most importance to the vast majority of the American people, and that is creating the millions of jobs we desperately need and making sure that people have income that they can afford to live in dignity with. Madam President, the sad reality is and we need to focus on these issues, is that poverty is increasing, is that in many ways the great middle class of this country, once the envy of the world, is disappearing, and sadly the gap between the very, very wealthy and everyone else is growing wider and wider. We must not have an economy where just the people on top, just the multinational corporations do extremely well, while the vast majority of the people are struggling to make ends meet. Madam President, since 1999, the average middle-class family has seen its income go down by nearly $5,000 after adjusting for inflation. Median family income today is lower than it was in 1996. So all over this country, people get up in the morning, often husbands and wives, work long hours, and they come back and they find that they are worse off financially than they were 10, 15 years ago. And when you ask people and what direction, how the country is doing, and why they think the country is moving in the wrong direction, that is precisely the reason why. People are working long, hard hours, and they're falling further and further behind. Madam President, I understand that when we pick up the newspapers, they tell us that unemployment is 7.5%. That is one way of looking at unemployment, but if you look at it in a more accurate way, including those people who have given up looking for work, people who are working part-time when they want to work full-time, real unemployment in this nation today is 13.9%, and it is high time that this Congress began addressing that issue. In fact, more than 20 million Americans today do not have a full-time job when they want to be working full-time. And another issue that has not received the attention that it deserves is youth unemployment. And youth unemployment is especially painful because you have young people graduating high school, graduating college, wanting to go out, begin their careers, begin their adult lives, and they can't find a job. Or in some cases, if they graduate college, they are finding a job which does not require a college degree. The youth unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-old workers today is 16.2%. 16.2%. For teenagers, the overall unemployment rate is 25.1%. For African American teens, the number is 43.1%. Believe it or not, Madam President, the United States has now surpassed much of Europe in the percentage of young adults without jobs, according to a recent article in the New York Times. So, Madam President, we have done well for a variety of reasons in dealing with deficit reduction. But now it is time to turn to those young people throughout this country, kids who are looking forward to getting out on their own, earning a living, and help them get the kind of jobs they need to succeed in life and to start their adult life off in a good direction. Madam President, each and every year, when we talk about young people, we should understand that another real tragedy is taking place in our country, and that is because of the disappearing middle class and the high cost of college education. Some 400,000 high school graduates do not go to college, not because they are unqualified, but because they cannot afford it. And what a tragedy that is, to waste all of that intellectual capital. Who knows what those kids might do if they were able to get a college degree. But now, because of declining incomes for their families and the high cost of college education, they are unable to do it. This is an issue we must also focus on. Madam President, from 1969 to 2009, median earnings for male high school graduates plummeted by almost 50% after adjusting for inflation. Let me repeat that. From 1969 to 2009, median earnings for male high school graduates plummeted by almost 50% after adjusting for inflation. Men without a high school education have fared even worse. Their inflation-adjusted median earnings have shrunk by nearly two-thirds over the past 4 decades. What is that about? Well, what that is about is there was a one time in this country when people did not have even a high school degree or just a high school degree, they could go out and get a job. And maybe that job was in a factory, and maybe it wasn't the greatest job in the world. But if you worked in a factory, and especially if you had a union job in that factory, you could make a decent wage. You could make it into the middle class. But sadly, those jobs have to a very significant degree disappeared. We've lost over 50,000 factories in this country in the last 10 years, millions of decent-paying jobs. What opportunities are there now available for young people who just graduate high school or may not even graduate high school? At best, they're going to work in McDonald's, they're going to work in Walmart for inadequate wages. But the truth is that many of those young people are finding it difficult to obtain any kind of job. Madam President, there is another issue that we must focus on, and that is distribution of wealth in this country. Because at the end of the game of economics, we want to know who wins and who loses. And clearly what has been going on in this country in recent years is the people on top are doing phenomenally well, while the middle class is shrinking and poverty is at a very, very high rate. Madam President, according to a report that came out on April 23rd, 2013, a couple of weeks ago, from the Pew Research Center, all of the new wealth generated in this country from 2009 to 2011 went to the top 7% of American households, while the bottom 93% of Americans saw a net reduction in their wealth. All of the new wealth from 2009 to 2011 went to the top 7%. Madam President, today the wealthiest 400 individuals in this country own more wealth than the bottom half of America, 150 million people. 400 people here, 150 million people there. That is not what this great country was supposed to be about. Today, one family, the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, are worth $100 billion. That is more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. One family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Today, the top 1% own 38% of all financial wealth, while the bottom 60% own 2.3%. In case people didn't hear that correctly, or maybe they're scratching their heads, let me say it again. Top 1% owns 38% of all financial wealth in this country, while the bottom 60% owns 2.3%. And that gap between the billionaires and everybody else is getting wider and wider and wider. And in fact, as Warren Buffett has pointed out, we are seeing a massive shift of wealth from the middle class to the billionaire class. Warren Buffett pointed out recently that the 400 wealthiest Americans are now worth a record-breaking $1.7 trillion, more than 5 times what they were worth just 2 decades ago. Meanwhile, according to a June 2012 study from the Federal Reserve, median net worth for middle-class families dropped by nearly 40% from 2007 to 2010. So what we are seeing is a massive shifting of wealth from the middle class, from the working class of this country, to the people on top, and that gap between the very, very wealthy and everybody else is now wider than it has been since the 1920s in this country, and wider than any major country on earth. So, Madam President, what's my point? My point is that deficit reduction is important. We must continue to focus on it. But we cannot forget about the economic reality facing the men, women, and children of this country, facing senior citizens of this country. And it is high time that we began to address some of the major economic problems that we face. Now, in terms of job creation, Madam President, most economists will tell you that the fastest way to create jobs is to put Americans back to work rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. In my state of Vermont and in states all over this country, there is a desperate need to repair and rebuild our roads, bridges, dams, culverts, sewers, schools, and affordable housing. If we do this, if we start investing in our infrastructure, making sure that broadband is accessible in every area in this country, cell phone service is available in every area of this country, rebuilding our roads, bridges, rail, we will make this nation more productive, and at the same time we can put millions of people back to work at all kinds of work. The American Society of Civil Engineers has graded America's roads, public transit, and aviation infrastructure with a D+. They say we must invest $1.6 trillion more than we are currently planning to spend on infrastructure over the next 7 years just to get a passable condition. When we make that investment, we improve life in America. People do not have to go over potholes. Bridges do not have to be closed down. We can develop a first-rate rail system to compete with Europe, Japan, and China, and we can create jobs doing that. Second point, Madam President, in terms of job creation, we can create significant numbers of jobs transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel and into energy efficiency and such sustainable energies as wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass. And when we do that, we begin to start addressing the planetary crisis of global warming, we begin to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions, and we create good-paying jobs doing that. Thirdly, Madam President, we have got to take a hard look at our disastrous trade policy, which for many years has been corporate America's policy and a policy of Republicans and Democrats alike. And despite all of the evidence that unfettered free trade has resulted in the loss of millions of decent-paying jobs in this country, as corporations shut down here, move to China, Vietnam, and other low-wage countries, we still have Democrats and Republicans coming forward doing the bidding of corporate America so that these companies can get cheap labor abroad while increasing unemployment in this country. We have got to take a hard look at our trade policies. And I know that come every election campaign, 2 weeks before the election, all of the candidates have ads on television bashing China, ads on television talking about trade policy. Somehow, the day after the election, everybody forgets it. And whether it's a Democratic president, whether it's a Republican president, whether it's a Republican House, whether it's a Democratic Senate, we still continue moving down the road of this disastrous trade policies. And that means NAFTA, CAFTA, permanent normal trade relations with China. We've got to take a hard look and rethink those policies. Last point that I want to make, Madam President, is that while we're making progress on deficit reduction, we have got to be appreciative that some of the people on whom we have balanced the budget are some of the most vulnerable people in this country. And that while 1 out of 4 major corporations pays nothing in taxes, while corporations are stashing their money in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda and other tax havens, we have made devastating cuts in programs that people can ill afford. Just as a result of sequestration, This is what is happening in the real world. At a time when over 20 million Americans are unemployed or underemployed, unemployment insurance checks, which average about $300 a week, try living on $300 a week, are being cut by 10.7%. In other words, those who are out of work through no fault of their own are having their unemployment benefits reduced by more than $32 a week on average. Now, $32 here is what people spend for lunch. But if you're a working family and you're unemployed, $32 is a question of whether you buy food for the kids or not. We've got to replace that loss. At a time when early childhood education is more important than ever, when we do an abysmal job in terms of child care and preschool education already as a result of sequestration, 70,000 kids are losing access to Head Start and early Head Start programs. That is unacceptable. Madam President, I am chairman of the subcommittee which deals with aging, and I can tell you that millions of seniors right now are struggling, figuring out how to pay their food bills, buy their prescription drugs, keep warm in the wintertime. At a time when food insecurity is skyrocketing as a result of sequestration, tens of thousands of senior citizens have been denied access to the Meals on Wheels program. Meals on Wheels is a program that goes to the weakest, most fragile, most vulnerable people in this country, elderly people who cannot get out of their homes, and meals are delivered to them. For these people, this is a question of life and death, whether they're going to live with a modicum of dignity or not. Those programs have been cut as a result of sequestration. At a time when millions of Americans cannot afford the cost of housing, 140,000 low-income families, primarily seniors with disabilities and families with kids, are losing rental assistance because of cuts to the Section 202 Elderly Housing Program, the Section 811 Disabled Housing Program, and a number of other affordable housing programs. Madam President, at a time when the cost of a college education is becoming increasingly out of reach for working families, 70,000 college students, as a result of sequestration, are losing federal work-study grants. Some of them will not be able to stay in college. At a time when 45,000 Americans will die this year because they don't have access to health care, sequestration has forced doctors and cancer clinics to deny chemotherapy treatments to thousands of cancer patients because of a 2% cut to Medicare providers. LIHEAP, which is the Low-Income Heating Energy Home Energy Assistance Program, very important for the state of Vermont, is being cut by $180 million, meaning people will go cold next winter.
Time of the senator has expired.
Okay. So, Madam President, let me conclude by just saying this. We have made progress on deficit reduction. That's a good thing. Now it is time to pay attention to the needs of working families all over this country and put people back to work. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Indiana.
Madam President, could I inquire as to how much time I'm allowed here in morning business?
There are 10-minute allotments for the senators.
I thank you.